So now we move on 600 years to the hesychast controversy. A theologian is one who truly prays, as Evagrius famously said, and one who truly prays is a theologian. Until the hesychast controversy, the range of meaning of theologia continued to include the experiential knowledge of God, but often it referred to the doctrines of the church, or simply to just talking about divine things. That's not to imply that such talk could be engaged in lightly. Do not theologize in an unconsidered manner, says Evagrius again, and do not define the divine, for definitions belong to created and composite beings. For Evagrius, theology as a body of doctrine, together with the contemplation of natures, is an indispensable first step in the ascent to divine knowledge. For without them, he says, no one will see the Lord. In tandem with contemplation, theology leads to the vision of God. Dionysius the Areopagite follows the Evagrian tradition in his understanding of theology, exalting the signification of the word even further. Theology is not just the product of human reflection, but is the very teaching of the Holy Scriptures. Indeed, ipansophos και αληθέστατη theologia is in essence the Scriptures. It is the knowledge of God possessed by the ranks of angels closest to him, a knowledge that is transmitted by them to human beings as that much hymned and most venerable theology, Holy, holy, holy Lord Sabaoth, all the earth is full of his glory. Consequently, the Church's theology, the Eucharistic liturgy, is in the deepest sense the recapitulation of theology. It's often asserted that the terminology of apophatic and cataphatic theology was introduced by Dionysius the Areopagite. Certainly, Dionysius takes the distinction between the two theologies for granted. But although he speaks of the affirmations and complementary negations, apheresis, that mark the route to union, he never discusses the distinction explicitly, nor does he ever actually use the expression apophatic theology. In fact, the terms cataphatic and apophatic go back to Aristotle's prior analytics, where they are used to characterize positive or negative propositions. Thereafter, they're used more often with reference to logic than to theology, even by figures such as Maximus the Confessor and John Damascene. So far as I've been able to discover, the first detailed examination of the relationship between cataphatic and apophatic theology was made in the 14th century in the context of the hesychast controversy. Palamas was led to discuss the relationship between the two by the claim of his opponents that apophatic theology was not only the highest level of knowledge of the divine, but also denied the legitimacy of distinguishing between the divine essence and the divine energies. He rejects equally Varlam's assertion that apophaticism denies certain knowledge of God, Akindinos' claim that apophatic theology negates cataphatic theology, and Grigoras's attempt to instruct him on the difference in Aristotelian logic between apophasis and cataphasis. On the basis of Dionysius' teaching on ecstasis, he holds that we must go beyond theology to attain to the experiential knowledge of God. Theology has its uses, but it does not in itself lead to the experience of God. Drawing on John Damascene, Palamas insists against Varlam and Akindinos that apophatic theology is not opposed to cataphatic theology. It neither contradicts it nor denies it. That is because negation and affirmation do not deny and affirm the same thing. Each has a different referent. Palamas gives several examples, among them motion and being. With regard to divine motion, we say that God is ever moving, ai kinitos, and also that he is motionless, akinitos. Not in an antinomic sense, but because the divine reality exceeds our ability to encapsulate it in any form of words. In this instance, we're actually referring to different senses of the word motion, according to whether we're speaking affirmatively or negatively. With regard to being, we're not dealing with different senses of the verb to be. Negation and affirmation both refer to divine existence, but on different levels. Negation does not mean that God does not exist. It means he transcends being. Apophatic and cataphatic theologies thus complement each other. They're also present in theological symbolism. Symbols and analogies of the divine reflect both the negative and the affirmative aspects. Maximus the Confessor, says Gregory, speaking allegorically, called the light of the Transfiguration a symbol of both cataphatic and apophatic theologies, in view of the greater reality containing the lesser, and also in view of its containing within itself the knowledge of theology and being productive of it. Yet, theology has its limitations. Whether apophatic or cataphatic or symbolical, it remains a matter of human speech. Speaking about God and encountering God, insists Palamas, are not the same thing. Beyond speaking about God lies the experience of God, which is best expressed as seeing him. Theology, Palamas claims, is as distant from the vision of God and as distinct from conversing with God as knowing is different from possessing. Against theologia, Palamas sets Theoptia, the vision of God, which requires not so much theological learning as purity of life. Where then does mystical theology fit in? Is not mystical theology much more than a matter of human speech? The expression mystical theology was introduced by Dionysius, the Areopagite, as the title of his brief treatise on the ascent of the mind to the deity, which in itself remains wholly outside the realm of discourse. The goal is union with that which is utterly unutterable. Mystical theology is thus the climax of the apophatic way. But it was not an expression taken up very much by Byzantine authors. There's nothing comparable in the Greek tradition to Albert the Great's detailed commentary on the Latin versions of Dionysius' mystical theology. For Albert, mystical theology is chiefly the ascent to union with God by a process of abstraction which prepares one for the reception of uncreated noetic light as a principle of cognition. On the Greek side, the emphasis is on the vision of light through ecstasis and participation in divine glory. Very few Greek authors, chiefly Maximus, Nikitas Stithatos, and Gregory Palamas, refer explicitly to Dionysius' mystical theology, even if it underlies much of their theological discussion. The contrast with the Latins is quite striking. Palamas himself only mentions mystical theology in 3 of his early treatises, in the second letter to Varlam. In the most significant of these texts, he adapts a passage from Dionysius' Epistle 8, in which he invokes the Areopagites' authority in order to play down the importance of the demonstrative argumentation on which he had previously relied and in which Varlam had proved to be so expert. According to Dionysius, theology is twofold, he says. On the one hand, it is mystical, perfective, unutterable, ineffable, and it operates and establishes in God by mystagogies that cannot be taught. On the other, it is manifest and philosophical and apodictic, and it persuades and demonstrates the truth of what is said. For Palamas, the former kind of theology, the mystical, is not theologia at all, but theoptia. The trouble with Varlam, says Palamas, is that he doesn't know that theoptia differs from theologia. He does not distinguish seeing God from talking about God. The divine illumination that Varlam claims for pagan Greek philosophers is, if anything, demonic. To know God is to experience him. To experience him is to share in the eternal light, which is distinct from creatures and transcendent and yet other than the divine essence. Therefore, that spiritual light, says Palamas, is not that which is seen, but is also the power by which we see, being neither a sensation nor an intellection, but some kind of spiritual power supremely transcending all created cognitive faculties and made present by grace in purified rational natures. Varlam denies that there is any vision superior to the intellectual activity of apophatic theology, because he knows nothing, in Palamas' view, about contemplation, theoria. My good man, says Palamas, addressing Varlam directly, contemplation is different from theology, because talking about God is not the same thing as acquiring the vision of God. Within this talking about God, the apophatic, for Palamas, is actually inferior to the cataphatic. As Palamas was later to say to Akindinos, apophatic theology does not even come near to cataphatic theology. The former sets before the mind, rather, the latter's transcendence, since all things posited by us about God are posited truly. But what belongs to God is beyond what it is possible for us to say and to think. What may be said or thought positively about God is more valuable than what may be said or thought negatively. But in the end, contemplation transcends all words and all thoughts. In his debate with Varlam, with its focus specifically on apophatic theology, Palamas embarks in the third treatise of the second triad on a detailed analysis of how the vision of God, Theoptia, relates to theology in order to refute Varlam's claim that since apophatic theology is our highest form of divine knowledge, we're ultimately left with agnosia, or agnosticism, with regard to the nature of God. The term theoptia had been used before Dionysius, notably by Cyril of Alexandria, to indicate the vision or contemplation of God by the prophets. It's Dionysius, however, the first writer to attribute theoptia to the highest order of the angels, who is Palamas' guide in this respect. Referring explicitly to the Areopagite, Palamas discusses the vision of God not only by the angels, but also among us by the prophets, Zechariah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. Daniel is of special interest to him on account of what happened after his vision of the ram and the goat in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, Daniel 8. A voice instructed Gabriel to make Daniel understand the vision. Note, says Palamas, that in the case of this symbolic vision, Gabriel is not told to transmit the vision, but to make it understood. The mediation of the angel conveys the grace of knowledge. A more direct vision is possible, however. even if no human being or angel has seen God, for in the case of human beings and angels, the mode of vision is either sensory or intellectual. The one who came nearest to such direct vision was Moses. In the case of Moses, Palamas says, theology states that the outline of the law was given through the angels. It was not that vision and theoptia that was given, but the initiation into that vision. Even Moses did not see God face to face. One needs to become spirit and to see in the spirit in order to see God, in accordance with the principle that like will be able to see like. Thus, it is only the deified Christian who will see God. This Palamas examines the nature of this supreme union, again with the help of the great Dionysius, this union of the vision of God by the deified Christian. Is it apophatic theology, he asks? No, union with God is not achieved by abstraction. It is achieved by ecstasy, by going out of oneself. Appealing to the testimony of Dionysius, Palamas says that all negations must fall away to reveal a person, Christ, contemplated hypostatically as light. We do not need to go out of ourselves in order to occupy ourselves with apophatic theology, but we do need to go out of ourselves in order to attain union with God. Apophatic theology belongs to the level of intellection, whereas union with God is ineffable and beyond intellection. And when one is rapt by this union, one abandons all the knowledge that comes through study and effort. This ecstasy, says Palamas, is incomparably higher than apophatic theology, for it only belongs to those who have attained dispassion. To understand the connection between ecstasis and theoptia, it's perhaps not irrelevant to recall the optical theory that was taken for granted by late antique and Byzantine Greek thinkers. The eye itself was considered a source of light. Vision occurred when the energia streaming forth from the eye mingled with the energia coming from the object and returned to the beholder's eye. Vision was therefore not simply a passive activity. It involved a going out from oneself, a kind of ecstasis, and a return. In the third treatise of the second triad, which we've been considering here, Palamas has been following and explicating Dionysius in response to an opusculum circulated by Varlam but destroyed after the Council of 1347, entitled On Knowledge. The emphasis here is on gnoseology, and in this context, theoptia trumps intellection, theologia. But what of the Christological and Trinitarian dimensions of theoptia? Palamas doesn't ignore them. Indeed, they become central as the hesychast controversy comes to focus more and more on the correct exegesis of the Transfiguration. The nature of the experience of the apostles at the Transfiguration was in fact an underlying concern of the hesychast controversy from the beginning. The Tomos of the Holy Mountain, drawn up by Gregory Palamas and endorsed by an Athonite monastic council in 1340, states, with Varlam in mind, that whoever says that the light which shone about the disciples on Tabor was a phantasm and a symbol of such a kind that it comes into being and passes away, but possesses no genuine existence and is not beyond all understanding, but is an activity inferior to understanding, is in clear contradiction to the opinion of the saints. The light seen on Mount Tabor cannot be explained as a construction of the human mind, or as a transitory symbol, or as a created luminous energy. such explanations would make participation in the divine impossible. They would deprive believers of the highest goal of their humanity, which is to attain deification through grace. Because in the vision of the light of Tabor, they would be encountering some mediating reality, not the divine itself. Turning later to Akindinos, Palamas says that, like Varlam, he's unaware that the ineffable vision, which is beyond all theology, is neither sensation nor intellection, but is an indescribable energy, seen invisibly and conceived mentally without discursive reasoning by those to whom it is granted to see and to experience, idinte kepathin, the radiance of God. But this inexplicable vision and participation is not revealed in any other way than through faith. What is needed is more than divine intellections, important as these are. It is the experiencing of God, suffering the divine, pathon tathia, as Dionysius puts it. When Grigoras assumed the leadership of the anti-Palamite faction after the disgrace and death of Akindinos, Palamas resumed his discussion of the Transfiguration in response to Grigoras' contention that the light seen on Mount Tabor was not a direct experience of divinity, but a phasma, an image constructed by the mind on the basis of information conveyed by the senses. Grigoras was a formidable opponent with a philosophical expertise that Palamas tries to belittle as his pride in his scientific demonstrations of theology. Grigoras puts a question to Palamas. If the light of Tabor is divine, yet something other than the divine essence, why was it not seen before the Transfiguration? Was it willed or was it unwilled by God? That it was willed or involuntary can be discounted theologically. But if it was willed, it had a beginning in time and was therefore created. Palamas characterizes the question as labyrinthine. It appears to concede that the light is divine, yet something other than the divine essence, but then goes on to deny it. After much criticism of what today we'd call Grigoras' methodology, Palamas responds to the question at length. First, he argues for a distinction between the divine essence and the divine energy, drawing on what for him is a key text, the Septuagint version of Joel 3:1, also quoted by Peter, according to Acts 2:17, in his homily on the first Pentecost. I shall pour out from my spirit on all flesh. Notice, from my spirit, apo tu pneumatos. It is, this apo is missing in the English translations and that we use. Palamas took this apo to prove that there was a distinction between the Holy Spirit and his gift of grace, which was nevertheless not an ontological distinction. The distinction between the divine essence of Christ and the light emanating from him at the Transfiguration, he argues, was of a similar nature. For that light's being created because it had its being in time, as Grigoras argues, Palamas counters by appealing to St. John Damascene, who says in his homily on the Transfiguration that what happened on Mount Tabor was Christ's making his glory visible to the apostles, not his bringing the light into being in a temporal sense. For someone who rates Theoptia incomparably higher than theologia, Palamas devotes an extraordinary number of pages to theological analysis. In this respect, he presents a marked contrast to his contemporary hesychast, Gregory of Sinai. Yet, if we compare the homilies on the Transfiguration of the two Gregories, we don't find a significant difference in their approaches. Palamas may be more polemical than the Sinaites, sending out a number of barbs against those who don't receive the exegesis of the fathers, but attempt to introduce opposed doctrines from their own minds. Yet he too wants to inspire in his hearers a longing to share through Christ in the ineffable light of the Holy Trinity. Palamas appears to have had a naturally combative nature, and Varlam had presented him with a challenge to the hesychast tradition which he couldn't ignore. But for him, as for the Sinaites, it was not theological speculation, but the ascetical preparation of oneself through purity, dispassion, and faith, which led to union with God. It is nothing less than this union with God which ultimately constitutes contemplation. Father Andrew Love concludes his classic work of 40 years ago, Discerning the Mystery, with the observation that theology is not simply a matter of learning. Rather, he says, theology is the apprehension of the believing mind combined with the right state of the heart, the awakening in the heart of a sense of wondering awe, which is the light in which we see light. Thus, even before embracing orthodoxy, Father Andrew shows himself to follow in the tradition of St. Gregory Palamas, who taught that through contemplation, with inner eyes, the great vision of Christ's glory at the Transfiguration, we learn to stand on our own holy ground. So we will gain in confidence, says Palamas, dwelling in the light of God, and we shall be filled with light even as we press forward, and we shall share in his eternity as we are filled with light, to a glory of that brilliance that is utterly single in its power, yet formed of three sons, now and always, for the ages of ages. Thank you.